Hello, hello. Welcome back to Sew What? The Imperfect Sewist. This is a podcast where I hold your hands through your beginner sewing journey. And today we're going to be talking about conquering the beginner sewing scares. I'm going to be sharing 5 tips that will take your sewing from to wow, that's awesome. You made that. So come along and be sure to stay through for number 5, because number 5 is actually where I tell you the one thing that has helped me through the years to make my sewing look more professional, more crisp, and much more appealing to the eyes when it's completed. So let's go ahead and get started. First, I want to talk about, and I'm looking down here because I do have my notes here. So when you see me looking down, that's exactly what I'm doing. I want to talk about the 5 areas that could create issues when you first start sewing. And the last one, again, like I said, is one of those things that once you fix that, you're going to be awesome. Okay. Like they say, it'll be golden. Anyways, the first thing is falling into the hype, falling for the hype and thinking what you see on TikTok, what you see on Instagram, what you see on all these other social media platforms are people who, they just picked up a sewing machine one day and the next day they're doing great. Let me just tell you, that is not the reality. Sewing does involve starting from the beginning, learning your sewing machine tension, learning how things work, to actually putting things together using your imagination and eventually coming out with a finished product. So when you see people who say, my husband gifted me a sewing machine for Christmas and today I can sew a whole fashion runway attire. Don't fall for the hype, okay? Just know that everybody started somewhere. It's usually possible that they've learned it. They've taken some classes at a library and things like that, and that has contributed to what they're doing today. And not to say that some people are not fast learners. There's always that exception to the rule, but for the most part, the rule is that if you're sewing and you're starting, it takes some time to get used to it. So just remember that everyone started from somewhere. Rome was not built in a day. So you want to make sure that you're giving yourself time and giving yourself grace when you're sewing. Don't feel like you have to, today you start and tomorrow you can make a whole tote bag. And just a shameless plug, my next live on YouTube will be about sewing a tote bag. So if these are things you're interested in, I from time to time share little projects that are very, very easy to make and are things that a beginner will want to pick up and use to strengthen their sewing skill set. Now, the next thing I wanted to talk about is demystifying the sewing machine monster, and this has to do with tension and threading. I can't tell you how many people I have taught who do not know how to properly thread their machine. I say that, and I know that there are people who say, like, this is how I've seen this, or this is what I've seen, or whatever. Did you know that you do have to adjust the tension of your machine based on the fabric you're working on? I bet you didn't know that. So, you want to make sure that you understand these things. Don't just jump into a project without thinking through it. A thicker fabric might require looser tension because it has a little more space to work with as far as between the fabric pieces. And a lighter fabric might, a thicker fabric requires less tension, and a lighter fabric might require more tension because you want to make sure you're holding things together. So these are some of the things that you want to think about. And then you can, think about things like silk or satin, your thread, what kind of thread you use an elastic thread. All of these things play into your sewing journey. So when you're doing this, when you start sewing and you're starting to think about, okay, I want to sew a tote bag. What are the materials I'm going to be working with? How thick are the materials? What kind of needles will I be using? All of these things play together. And once you master what you're supposed to use, and let me just tell you, Gemini, ChatGPT, Claude, Gronk, whatever it is you're using, all of these things have the tips that you need. So you're not in this by yourself. There are ways to get the information you need to make sure that your sewing continues to look fabulous. So be sure to also look before you start a project, especially as a beginner sewist. Over time, you'll eventually know, I'll use an example. I sew hair bonnets and shower caps, as part of my business. And a lot of times when I am doing that, I don't use the same thread, or I might not be using the same needle, because a shower cap, obviously based on the material that I'm working with, I don't want an extra large needle, because guess what? It's going to create holes in the material. And then when that happens, it defeats the purpose of using, making a shower cap. Versus if I was doing a satin bonnet, which, it's a little more forgiving. But at the same time, I need to understand the tension so that it's not too tight and my satin doesn't look too scrunched up, or the thread isn't the right thread and things start to look funky. So I say all this to say, make sure you understand the tension and the way the thread you're using and the needle as well. That's a bonus tip there. The needle as well, to ensure that when you're sewing, you are doing the right thing with what you need and you're using the right combination. Again, like I said, go use what you have available. Don't spend money trying to do multiple things. Use your, AI platform. And if you're anti-AI, you can always pick up a sewing book. Your sewing machine manual, if you still have the written copy or the hard copy, your sewing machine manual at the back of it will tell you the materials, the needle, and the type of thread you need. It has all the recommendations and also the bobbin. So again, don't feel like if that it's not a one size fits all for everything. And to have your sewing project looking more professional, you want to make sure you're using the right setting, you're using the right needle, you're using the right tension. And when all of these things come together, it starts to look much better, much crisper, and look more professional. Okay, so that the third thing I wanted to talk about is the danger of advanced beginner traps. So again, going back to what I said earlier, you've probably been on several social media platforms. You've been on TikTok, you've been on YouTube. You're watching me now on TikTok or on a podcast feed, and you see these people, and they're doing awesome. Like when I first actually started embroidering, I was one of those people that I would binge watch embroidery videos on any platform. Like till this day, like if you have an embroidery video and it's a cute design, you better believe I will sit there and watch it. Okay. And I feel like that's kind of one of those things that beginners fall into a trap for. So for me, I'd never embroidered before. I only started embroidering, I would say, about 5 years ago. And maybe a little longer than 5 years. I started a little before the pandemic, and the pandemic was 2020, so maybe a little over 6 years. And I started, seeing these videos, and I saw people creating all these beautiful things, and I was just like, oh my gosh, this is so awesome. I can do this. And silly old me thinking, okay, you know what? I've been sewing for years. How hard can this be? And I went in and I bought all these expensive designs off of Etsy. I joined every single platform or every single website that offered free embroidery designs, because I just knew I was going to be creating the most, beautiful designs and all of that. But let's just say that eventually led to paralysis, like sewing paralysis, because eventually I started to dread turning on my machine. Why? Because I got frustrated. I didn't understand that there was a difference between using a water-soluble stabilizer versus a cutaway stabilizer versus a wash-away stabilizer versus a tear-away stabilizer. Like, these were all things that were needed, and I didn't understand that because I was watching people on screen who just put things together and everything looks great, right? So, like I said earlier, you see the tail end. Don't let social media fool you into thinking that there was no work or no effort that goes into it. I often tell people when they say, like I've seen several videos on social media where people complain, why are you selling a hair bonnet for $30? Well, guess what? You're paying for part of the skill sets that came with it. It's not something that was manufactured in a factory or through a manufacturing line. For me, anyways, I sell, custom embroidered hair bonnets, for example. So that takes the cost for the design, putting it together, making sure that everything looks right on on my screen before I transfer it to my machine. And when I transfer it to my machine, I need to make sure my machine has the right settings. And then after that, I need to make sure that I'm cutting the fabric the right way. I need to make sure if it's a directional fabric, it's facing the right direction. And then after that, I cut away the stabilizer and all of that. And those things all add up. But someone who will see a video from me when I do the behind the scenes will only see me hooping my machine, hooping my hoop, and then taking it right to the machine and then letting everything happen. And social media fools all of us, right? That's what I always say. It fools all of us because you see that and you're just like, oh my gosh, yeah, I could do that. But you forget that before that social media feed, I've probably paused and unpaused my computer or my phone or whatever device I'm using. I've done that multiple times, so I always joke that, you'll see a 3-minute video, but behind every 3-minute video is a 30-minute effort to get you to that video. So just remember, you don't need to be like the people you see on social media. Take your time, learn the behind the scenes, the true behind the scenes, learn what goes into to everything. Don't feel like if your project doesn't look exactly like, the model you saw on social media or whatever the person did on social media, don't feel like if you don't get that, then you're a failure. You are not. Everything starts from the start to finish. Eventually I had to sit back and step back and say, okay, so why don't my designs look like what I'm seeing on social media? And some of the things I had to learn and read and research on my own outside of the social media, foo-foo and all the things I was saying was, okay, so you're sewing. What kind of materials are you sewing? You need to learn that. What kind of needle do you need for your embroidery machine to make sure that it continues to function like it's supposed to? How do you hoop your machine? Are you using a magnetic hoop? Are you doing a split design? If you're doing a split design, how do you ensure consistency across the board? And when you're cutting, do you need a special pair of scissors, which I did eventually get? These things all factored in, and then eventually I started making this, and I made one, I made two, I made three. They came out consistently good, and then I understood everything. And then, when I share a video, people think, oh, it's a 5-minute project or it's a 10-minute project, and you don't really realize that it does take time. So as a beginner, please don't fall for these, for this, because it does lead to paralysis. When I started, I eventually said, you know what, this is just not for me. As a matter of fact, I think if I look at my office, I could probably find the first embroidery project I started with. Oh my Lord, it was bad. It was so bad. Like, I still pick it up every now and then, and I look at it, it's in my bin over there, and I'm like, how on earth did I not get that the tension was completely off in this? But hey, you know what? We live, we learn. So don't fall for the hype, and don't let it lead you to paralysis. As a beginner sewist, you want to make sure that you're taking on projects that are actually adequate at your skill set, where you're comfortable, and then you can continue to build on those skill sets you've learned over time. Okay, so the next thing I wanted to talk about is ironing. Oh my gosh, if you have been following me for any amount of time, I hate ironing. And it's not that I hate it, it's just that I feel like it's a tedious another thing to take care of, okay? Is it my favorite thing? Probably not. But if you're a sewist, you're going to have to learn to iron, and you're going to have to learn to enjoy it. There's some things that you can use a clapper for, like, tailor's clapper to hold it down, to kind of crease your seams, to keep it down a little bit. But there's not a lot of those. There are things that you will need to make adjustments as you go. So ironing is definitely needed, especially as a beginner sewist. I would say, unless you're doing, for example, I'm going to be teaching a class this weekend that that is a beginner friendly class and it's a live class, free. So if you're interested, I'm going to be doing a live on YouTube. But for that class, if I wanted to teach someone how to do the handles of a tote bag, you need to know how to iron, and you need to have your irons, on standby, because that's going to help you understand the folds and everything. And when you have a crisp seam, like a crisp edge, it really does change the way your design or the outcome of your sewing project. I can't tell you how many times I've seen things where, actually, and myself, I've done this, where I sew things because I'm just being too lazy and I don't want to go back to my ironing board, and I sewed it, and only to realize, that's not a straight line. That doesn't even look straight under any circumstance, and that you don't want to finish and spend all that time putting something together and then looking at it and just like, it would have looked better if I had spent just 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 4 minutes, maybe 5, just ironing things to make sure it looked great. So I do encourage you, if you are someone who's a beginner sewist, spend the time to iron your project, especially when you're going through anything that involves a fold. Make sure you fold it properly. The other good thing too is when you iron, it increases the chances of you staying within the seam allowance. So most sewing patterns have a seam allowance, and if you're not ironing, you can eyeball it, but as a beginner sewist, you're not going to be getting that right on the first try. So make sure that you're using that as an opportunity to measure out your seam allowance, and then you're able to actually go through everything and continue to stay within what the pattern is calling for. So ironing is an important skill that you need to have. Now, I will tell you what has worked for me, because I hate having to log my big iron. I did buy a mini heat press. Okay, so those work like an iron as well. And then I created a board, and you can just pick up any wooden board from Hobby Lobby or Michael's or wherever, any craft stores, local craft stores you have around, and just take a staple. Like I have the heavy duty staple, and I have some batting, quilt batting. I used some thick one. I wrapped it in aluminum foil, and then used 100% cotton to wrap it, and just used my staple to hold it on the bottom. And that has been my ironing board. Like literally, the ironing board is this big. It's not that big, but it has been very helpful in ensuring that I don't feel lazy, or I'm not making an excuse for not ironing. So something like that, it's easy to just pull up. I mean, it's literally sitting right by my sewing table, so I have no excuse. If I have to do a sewing project, and most of the projects I do are much smaller projects. I used to do dresses and skirts and things for my kids and to sell way back when. That was when I first started, but now I don't necessarily do that. The bonnets I make are satin, so I don't, unless, which I don't store them like that. I'm looking up to make sure. Nope, none of them are stored like that. They're all stored horizontally, so I am fine. I don't necessarily have to iron, but if I had a project that required ironing, I have my small ironing board and my mini heat press, which is very easy to just pick up and get things done. So that's also another way that I get around this and ensure that I still have my seams and everything looking crisp and the lines looking very straight. So if you're someone who's, wanting to truly learn and dedicate the time it takes to getting this done, I do encourage you to get something like that. And I'm going to go ahead and link it. I link all of this in my in the description, so that if there's an item you want to pick up to help you along the way, you can feel free to pick it up. And I do also need to mention that I do get a small commission if you purchase your item from the link I have included in the below description. So here is the big reveal, the biggest thing, my $10 secret tool that I use all the time, and it has really truly helped me stay consistent. So if you watched my live a couple of weeks ago, 2 or 3 weeks ago now on YouTube, I said, as a beginner sewist, you don't necessarily need this item. I called it a gimmick. Yes, I did. But as you continue to sew, and as you continue to master things, and as you continue to understand seams and seam allowances and things like that, I do have a seam gauge, a magnetic seam gauge. And so in the video I posted, or in the live I did 2 weeks ago, I said, you don't need a magnetic seam. A magnetic seam guide. Why don't you need it? Well, because if you're starting out, you need to first understand your sewing machine. You need to understand the plate. You need to understand what a seam allowance is. You need to be ironing stuff. You need to know how to sew a straight line and all of that. But once you become more comfortable, having a seam guide, a magnetic seam guide on there, it shortens the time, and the time you have to spend having to go through everything. The time you have to spend having to, measure out everything to make sure that your seams are still coming out straight, right? So it's one of those things where I say it's good to learn the basics. You want to first know how to sew a straight line. You want to first know what a seam allowance is. You want to first know the distance between one seam and the second seam, especially if you're interested in getting into quilting eventually. You want to know, the distance, like what would you consider a good acceptable distance if you were sewing like a handle on a tote bag. Those are important things. And then once you understand how that works, you can use a seam guide as a way to just keep you going, to keep you moving, so that you don't feel like, okay, I have to measure out everything. Now you know what a seam is. Now you know how to sew a straight line. And, that was the point of that video a few weeks ago. So you already have all those basics down. So the only thing you need to do as you go and you continue to recreate and redo everything is having that magnetic seam gauge. All it does is it cuts down on the amount of time and the amount of measuring you need to do as you go along. But I am still a 1000% firm believer that when you're starting out, you need to first understand seams. You need to understand how to adjust for a seam allowance. You need to understand the difference between a seam, 5/8 of a seam allowance versus a 1/2 inch versus a 1/4 inch. Like all of these things play and factor into how your eventual finished products will look. So I feel like this is one of those things where a magnetic seam guide it's important. And even though I said it was a gimmick a few weeks ago, it was a gimmick because as someone who's starting out, you don't necessarily need it. But as someone who wants to take your sewing from to woo, you made that magnetic seam gauge seam guide is going to help you ensure that you're staying within your seam allowance and that you're measuring from top to bottom for everything you're doing. And most of those you just, snap it on there because you have the magnetic plate that's directly on your sewing machine next to your feed dog. So if you have a magnetic seam guide, you just put it on there and then you're good to go. And they're also small and they're out of the way, so they're not going to take up a lot of your overall sewing area. So that's also one of the great things. Now I've gone through all of these. I'm gonna, I feel like this is one of those things that when I first started, I wasn't sure whether or not it would be helpful, or things. So what I would say is when you start sewing, first of all, make sure you have the basics down. You're a beginner sewist. Don't put too much pressure on yourself. I have a bonus tip for you, and I will share that shortly, but don't push too much pressure on yourself. Sewing is supposed to be fun. Sewing is supposed to be about creating something different, something new, something that looks just amazing. So why put all that pressure on something that's supposed to look great? You don't want to finish your sewing project and look at it and like, I spent so much time on that. No, you want to finish your sewing project and feel like, wow, I've accomplished that. I got that done. So the tip I wanted to give you for sewing is if you're ever sewing and you feel that you have just hit that point where nothing seems to go right, get up, take a few deep breaths, and walk away. I have a meme that I shared a few weeks ago, and let me just close out with this. I have a meme I shared a few weeks ago, and I was talking, it was not a few weeks, maybe a few months now, and I was talking about the fact that, behind every wonderful, beautiful looking sewing project is a gazillion seam rippers that needed to go in there to correct the issues. Okay, so no, I don't know of any professional or anybody who sews that does not eventually run into a problem here or there. And your seam ripper is your friend, but a lot of times you don't need the seam ripper as much if you just take some time to step away and then come back with a refreshed look. I remember once when I was first sewing things for kids and stuff, and I had sewed a jumper, or I was attempting to sew a jumper for my daughter. Now, this was the first time I was doing a jumper with the crinoline underneath. So crinoline is just that, whoosh, whoosh thing. I can't even describe it. A whoosh, whoosh thing that you wear that makes the dress look all fluffy and happy and, poofed out. But anyways, I'm not a fashion or runway model designer, so I don't, all that stuff. But I wanted to add crinoline to her, to the skirt part of the jumper. And I ran into so many problems because, silly me had not thought through the entire project, right? I was including my crinoline, for those, if you haven't sewn a poofy skirt before, I was including it in the band of my skirt. And when I went to use my budkin, which is basically the tool you use to thread your elastic, it started running into problems because the crinoline is a little nitty and it would keep catching it. And I was just like, this is so frustrating. So I'll seam rip it out because I didn't want to ruin my crinoline or whatever, and then start all over again. And it wasn't until I got so frustrated and I was like, you know what, I'm not doing this anymore. And I just got up and I decided, hey, you know what, I'm just going to go do something else and then come back to this project because obviously it just wasn't working out at that point. And I stepped away, and then eventually, I don't know, it was like a light bulb just went off, and it was like, you didn't need to go through all of that. If you could, I had two options. I could either add the crinoline in between the fabric pieces, because I also had a lining, because the piece I was doing was like, I think I had gotten a whole bunch of handkerchiefs, and I was trying to make this jumper for if you have little ones, PJ Masks girl version of the jumper. So I was trying to do that and add all of this, and I was like, since I'm using multiple layers, I could just put the crinoline in between the two layers of fabric, and that worked out great. I'm gonna see if I can find a picture so I can post it up there, because she loved it. It was just the cutest little outfit. But at the same time, if I told you how many times I spent trying to get this thing to work, and all I had to do was step away, think through it, and come back with a fresh mind, a fresh attitude, and everything just looked much better, much crisper, and I achieved the look that my daughter really wanted. So I say all this to say, if you are starting to get frustrated, what has helped me through the years, get up, find something else to do, take your mind off of it, and eventually you'll be able to get it and, put it all together. Now, if you've enjoyed this video and you've stuck around this long, be sure to click on my playlist